look at.
Markham. Here. Middleton.
Only on this
Quarles?
side.
Quarles.
Yes.
McGilvray.
Here.
Howell.
Here.
Miller.
Here.
Long.
Here.
Cowell.
Here.
Oh, glad you came.
Zach.
Here. Thank you. We have a quorum. Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So do I have an approval of the minutes? I have Miller and Quarles. Are there any corrections? Any discussion?
Pam did it. I know, I was like,
Seeing none, all those in favor vote aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Motion carries. I need an approval, next is the approval of the agenda. Are there any changes or corrections? Okay. Moved by McGilvray, seconded by Long. Any discussion? Any comments? All in favor signify aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Motion carries. With that, do we have any public comment today? Or questions? Okay, seeing none, we move on. Next thing is the communications. And we need a motion to receive and file. And if there's, who wants to move it? Powell, support by Miller. Okay, and are there any questions? Yes. Commissioner Cowell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I just have a question about the one, the IT one, that, it's like 1.7 million, pretty much. And I know there's single source providers, but it's probably a dumb question, but is there any way that when we originally build these or go out for proposals that we can avoid ending up with, only one company that provides, or is that just an impossibility?
Yes, good morning, Commissioners. Mike Tim, Director of IT. This is a project that's part of our GIS, Geographic Information System infrastructure, which is a significant investment the county's made in. This particular product is what we use for CAMS, which is asset management. And it did go out for competitive bid when it was originally procured, and that was 10 years ago, 2009. It is a significant amount of money. This is a 5-year contract, so it's a $335,000 per year. But there are some things, some parts of IT infrastructure, once you make a decision, and a good example of this is Windows. Once you make a decision that you're going to execute on Windows infrastructure, you're kind of locked into that. Another example would be using Microsoft Office, which has become basically a de facto standard. I mean, nobody talks about Lotus anymore. People use Google Docs as an alternative, but we've made the decision to use Microsoft Office products, Excel, Word, PowerPoint, etc. And once you make that decision, it is almost cost prohibitive to change and go to a different infrastructure because of the cost of the change. In some ways it's similar, and part of the reason we took so long with PeopleSoft. We've been on the PeopleSoft platform for almost 20 years, and that's another example where once you make that strategic decision about a platform, it becomes very difficult to change it, and we have a $20-some million project to convert from PeopleSoft into Workday. So this is similar in that regard. Yes, it is a significant amount of money, but it supports all of the, basically the underground utility infrastructure. The mapping of all of that is all done with this particular product.
Well, thank you for your answer. I guess, when you go out for a competitive bid in the beginning, doesn't always guarantee are you I guess we're kind of, it's like when you buy a printer. The printer's cheaper and then they get you on the ink, but I just don't know if that's the situation here. I understand it's a particular situation, so.
If I could add to this from the financial perspective. So, when they go out to bid, the decision is not just the initial cost for, to acquire this system. They also evaluate the ongoing software maintenance costs. And so that is part of the total RFP decision. It's just once the initial period ends, and, you know, as Mike, said, it's a very expensive to change course at that point. And this also doesn't just support Oakland County operation, it supports local communities as well as the road commission, Parks and Rec. So there's multiple funding sources. So what you're seeing is the 5-year gross cost, but it's actually a cost shared program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori.
I have a question about this as well. So when we purchase cams, for example, and we're looking at the maintenance costs, is it a 10-year period, is it a 20-year period, is there a contract that ends and then they can raise the maintenance as high as they want, or is it to the life of the product?
We do typically, for IT projects, do a minimum 6-year return on investment evaluation before we do any procurement, and that's for all of our major projects. With some, we actually go out and extend that even further. We do have, because we've used this product for 10 years, there have been marginal price increases over that 10-year period, but they're frankly very standard compared to, you know, other competitors or other products in the marketplace. So, yeah, there have been slight increases that have kept pace with inflation, but it's nothing, you know, extraordinary compared to if we had to go out and do this competitively bid and bring another product in.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions about our contingency report? Seeing none, we need to call the roll. Voice vote. All those in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. So we will move on to the regular agenda, which is a presentation budget projections for fiscal year 2019 through 2024, a long-range fiscal plan. And I have,
I was thinking you could sit here and you could sit Bob, and then Lynn and I might change seats so I can help navigate.
and for the record, will you introduce yourselves, please?
I am Lori Van Pelt, Director of Management and Budget, and to the left of me is Bob Dado. He's Deputy County Executive and the Deputy Executive that I report to. And to my right is Lynn Sonkis, Manager of Fiscal Services, and on my far right is Dave Heber, Manager of Equalization. And the four of us are a team that work on the fiscal plan together. And so all four of us will be making the presentation to this morning. I'm going to start the presentation just to explain.
Excuse me, I need a
yes.
motion.
I'm sorry.
So, to receive and file, Commissioner Kowal with Commissioner Miller. Thank you. Now you may begin. Thank you.
And so this morning, I'm going to start the presentation just by giving a very broad overview about where this fits in the process, because some of you are new. And so just to distinguish this forecast from the budget process and explain the format for the primary one-page spreadsheet that includes the projections. And then at that point, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Heber so he can talk a little bit about the property tax revenue change assumptions as compared to the adopted budget. And we'll give you an update there since that's the primary revenue source for general fund, general purpose operations, represents about 50% of those resources. After Dave talks about that, then Lynn will cover the remaining adjustments for any major revenue changes and expenditure changes. And then Bob will wrap up by talking about items that are not included in this 5-year forecast that we ought to be concerned about and that we're monitoring. So with that, I'll get started unless there's any questions about the format of the presentation. So what I'd like to do is if you look at the spreadsheet that's in your packet, it's a.
PDF 274.
274? 274. Okay, thank you. That's what we're going to primarily speak about, and then as Dave and Lynn go, as Lynn goes through some of the items, then we'll scroll through the appropriate footnotes that reference those items. So what we do, if you look across the columns, we start with the adopted budget. So this is based on the budget that the Board of Commissioners adopted last September for fiscal years 2019, 20, and 21. So it's a 3-year line item budget, and those represent the starting figures. And so you'll see those at the top, and those are referenced as footnote A. And then in the adopted budget, within the budget message, that also included 2 additional fiscal years, so that we had a 5-year forecast summary in the budget message. And so those 5 years worth of numbers comes right out of the adopted budget book. And then what we do is we add a year for projected 2024. And that is basically identical to the adopted budget or the forecast for 2023. And then we make adjustments to that. So we pretty much take the 2023 information and roll it forward and adjust it as necessary so that we can get the next 5-year forecast. And if you look down at the very bottom left-hand corner, you'll see also references to footnote A. One thing that we do in Oakland County that sets us apart from many other governments is we don't just forecast revenues and expenditures, we also tie them into what those forecasted numbers, how that will impact our general fund equity. And so that's what kind of sets us apart and is really one of the key features as to why we're a AAA rated county, because we do pay attention to fund balance. So if you look at the bottom, what we do is we start with the equity position that was reported with the year-end closing, which came to this Board of Commissioners in December and recently published in the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. And so we start with that roughly $245 million equity position, and then we make several adjustments. You'll see there's 3 adjustments there: land sales operations, prepaid expenses and inventory, and carry forward amounts and encumbrances. So those are basically committed dollars that are restricted either by law or actions taken in the prior year, such as for encumbrances that are not spendable in future years. We back those out to arrive at an adjusted beginning equity position that could be used for future expenditures as determined by this Board of Commissioners. So we begin with the adjusted beginning equity available for future operations of $226 million roughly after those adjustments. And so you'll see if you go back up into the top part where I started under the column 2019, you'll see that number there with that $226 million. And so you'll see.
You gotta slow down.
Okay, I'm
a
sorry.
little
Yeah,
bit
thank
and
you.
let
Okay.
people know.
All right.
I'm looking, I'm losing
Okay.
people.
Yeah, if I had a pointer, I could point that out. So
Yeah.
are you all following at the top there at the 2019 column? So,
We are on PD.
274.
274.
That's fine.
Just know I'll be calling.
Would you like, if you'd like, maybe we could have copies made of the spreadsheet, and that might be easier to look at,
Yeah.
rather than on your tablet? If someone wouldn't mind doing that.
It's my staff.
Yeah, I have a hard
I've been
copy and I have,
staffing. Remember,
yeah.
I was staff for a
Okay,
long time,
so
I was getting up
while
to
we're
go
getting copies, I'm gonna recognize Commissioner Markham.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. And good morning, and thank you for coming and doing all this for us. My question relates to the equity fund balance. Clearly from 2019 through 2024, it's declining
Yes.
the whole time.
Yes.
Is that typical, or, I mean, if I went back 5 years, would the projections be the same? That we
you
would
would-
be spending the
yes.
fund, it would be less? So I could expect if we were in 2022, that fund balance might actually be larger? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, we will talk about that as to the targets that were established based on the fund balance policy that was established by this Board of Commissioners. So that's part of this presentation, and hopefully this will all make sense. But yes, you're
Okay.
right, it is it is declining. It was intended to decline. That was planned. So during the Great Recession, we started reducing the budget earlier, even though we were already balanced, because based on the forecasting abilities that you'll see from Dave Heber with respect to property tax revenue, we knew that property tax revenues were going to decline based on what Dave Heber was seeing at that time with real estate sales. And Dave will talk to you about the timing and how we were able to look at the data and know it was gonna affect future revenue. I think this will all become clear by the time I hope so, by the time we're done with this presentation. So we knew that, and so this Board of Commissioners and the county executive actually started reducing budgets, I believe it was in February 2007, which might seem counterintuitive because that was the peak of the real estate values. All the homes were basically at their top point, and home values had not started declining yet, but we could see from the data that Dave gave to us that home values were going to begin to decline, and quite severely, and we kept adjusting. So our county executive proposed that we establish budget targets at that time to start reducing the balance, the budget, so that we could build fund balance. So we were basically budgeting for a budget surplus back then. Because what we didn't want to do is we didn't want to start cutting budgets when we had to cut them. So, for example, some governments, they look back retroactively, not prospectively, as we were doing. So, for example, when we knew that we would be seeing a decline, Wayne County and Dave Heber tried telling them, we're seeing a decline. They said, no, we're budgeting for a 5% increase in taxable values, because historically that's what we had always gotten. So imagine after they close their fiscal year books and they get their equalization study down and it's already halfway through the fiscal year, and then they realize we did not get a 5% increase, but we took a 4% decrease in our taxable values. Now you've got a 9%, right, 4% plus the 5%. Now you have a 9% variance, and you only have maybe half of a fiscal year or 1/4 of a fiscal year to now balance your budget. That's what kept us out of trouble. We knew that once the property values declined, because of Proposal A and because of Headley, it would take a long time before we would ever see those taxable values rebound. And our estimates at the time were 22 to 25 years before we could ever see those restored. So that was when, and actually, so we proposed budget tasks. This Board of Commissioners supported that, and in fact, the Board of Commissioners accelerated it a half a year sooner and imposed them mid-year on all the departments rather than wait to the beginning of the next fiscal year. So we intentionally built up fund balance. We never expected to maintain fund balance at the high level that it's at. And we have the resolution number with the policy in it, and it was actually passed out in your information during the new commissioner orientation. So if you read that, basically it says that the minimum amount of fund balance that we're recommending that we maintain longer term is 20% of annual operations. So if you look at the far bottom right-hand corner, and we're gonna walk
Right.
through how we get there, you'll see that the projection for the target is $98.2 million roughly, and that's 20% of annual operations for 2024. And this plan actually forecasts that we're gonna have $98.1 million. So we're about $92,000 short, or as what Brooks characterized it when I went over this with him, he called it a rounding error. So we're essentially balanced over the next 5-year period. However, and so because of that, we're not recommending imposition of budget tasks for reductions on departments at this time. However, if we were to have been significantly below that, let's say it was $5 million off, we would have probably recommended to the board that we start considering budget task reductions again. This is the 8th year that the county executive has not recommended budget reduction tasks on the county department. So 9 years ago, they were still assigned a task, and we had done that probably for a good 7 to 8 years straight of budget reduction tasks. So the level of fund balance that you're seeing, that $245 million, that's just a temporary high mark And we always envision, so the way I used to like to characterize it, rather than cutting budgets and having to like do a steep ski slope, we just kind of want to glide down a bunny hill. And that's what our plan was always designed to be. And we always expected it would be a 10 to 20-year period that we would have to do this. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, yes. Okay, so I am new and I come in and we're at the high point.
Yes.
And just looking at the spreadsheet, in the next number of years that we're supposed to be managing things, somebody's spending all the money down. So your explanation as to why that's happening makes sense to me. I just want us to be sensitive to the fact that we still have to look at what we're going to spend this money on and decide that, yes, we want to continue to spend it the way it's being planned.
I
So-
totally agree with you.
Okay.
And our philosophy has also been, if we're going to use fund balance, we would prefer to use it for one-time type of needs. Because it's a one-time source of resource, right? So we always tried to match ongoing, that the one-time uses, our one-time source of revenue be used for one-time uses such as technology improvements or building improvements or things that we know are just a one-time type of program. We would not advise using it for ongoing things like to fund positions on an ongoing basis, because once you build those in, they're there forever. And so, yes, we totally are in sync with how you envision this.
Okay,
So-
thank you very much.
And that's actually what the fund balance policy says as well. And so I should probably slow down as requested and back up, because I told you I would explain that we start with this fiscal plan in advance of the county executive developing his budget recommendation. So this is just a 5-year forecast so that we can determine the trends and so that we can determine whether or not, as part of the budget recommendation, if what types of compensation adjustments we might be recommending, what types of county infrastructure recommendations might be included at the budget that we could afford, some of those one-time uses, and whether or not we're going to recommend any budget reduction tasks. So we do this at a very high level. We actually start this right after the annual financial records are closed. And then Dave goes through his process of doing his equalization report, because those are very important numbers. So we try to have this ready shortly after Dave's equalization report is finalized, because the revenue numbers are very important. And then we also, what's important is what the governor is recommending in terms of how it might impact our budget. So those are all the things that we're looking at, and we're doing this analysis. And it looks very simple because it's one page, but there's a lot of background analyses that go into this one-page summary. We just do a one-page summary because we actually try to make it easy and less complicated for you to understand. And this presentation is designed to improve the understanding of where these numbers come from. So with that, now that everyone has the hard copy, oh, and it's on the screen. Okay, so wonderful. So if you look at that top left-hand corner, thank you, Lynn. And so what you'll see there is the footnote A that I was talking about, where those numbers come from the adopted budget. And so let me just walk you through 2019 to begin with, okay? So we start with the total revenues, $433 million roughly. Are you all seeing that number under 2019? So that was the adopted budget for this year. And then we back out the adopted expenditures of $466.4 million. And so you can see the adopted budget plan to use fund equity of $38.8 million to support this year's operations and capital improvement plan and other types of things.
33.8, not 38.8.
I'm sorry, $33.8 million. Thank you,
They're
Lynn.
looking for that number sheet.
Thank you, I misspoke. And if you look across there, you can kind of see that bunny hill that I was talking about, right? So just stay on that row, planned use of equity, and you'll see the adopted budget. Assume that we would use $26.9 million in 2020, $25.5 million in 2021, $22.4 million in 2022, and then we are hoping to significantly reduce that down to $15.9 million by the time we got to 2023. So those are the, we would like to see that to be zero. When that gets to zero, then we would consider that to be structurally balanced. And structural balance, we define it as where ongoing revenues are equal to ongoing expenditures. And so then, at that point, if you have use of fund balance, it's only for those one-time type of uses that we were just talking about. So that's the long-term plan. This is what we've always explained to the bond rating analysts when they come in to meet with us, and they understand that, and that's where it sets Oakland County apart from many other governments, because most governments do not do this kind of planning and forecast on use of fund balance. So then when you go down to the next row below that $33.8 million, you'll see that number $226 million that I was just referencing. That's the adjusted beginning point for equity that's available for use going forward. And then you'll see that when you take this year's beginning adjusted equity, and then you back out that $33.8 million for planned use of equity, now we're projecting that we would end this fiscal year, this September 30th, based on the adopted budget, we would end with $192.1 million in fund equity when we close the books this year. I can tell you historically, because our departments are very conservative and because we budget for all positions at 100%, we usually have favorable surplus operations. And so every year we're usually we're always positive. However, this past year, you will remember that we used $19.8 million worth of fund equity, and that was primarily because of one-time type of projects that we knew were coming. The biggest single significant use of fund balance was for the Workday project, which impacts all the departments. It's the HR, financial, and purchasing and treasurer system that we're implementing. That's a very big project. That was over a $13 million appropriation. So that almost $14 million represents that $19.8 million that was used. There were also some security enhancements that were done around the county. So a lot of these, they were all planned. And the $19.8 million could all be tied to one-time type of uses. So for ongoing operations, we actually were balanced. But because we budget for all positions at full employment, you're always going to see use of fund balance until we can get to that structural balance. And Wall Street actually likes that we budget for all positions and that we don't include some assumed use of turnover or layoff scenario. So with that, what I want to do is maybe just show you that on the format, it's broken out into three main categories. So the first category are ongoing operating revenue adjustments. And the second category are ongoing operating expenditure adjustments. And then non-budgeted types of items. So the first two categories are what we see changes to the operating budget and what we see as our impacts. And again, Dave and Lynn are going to explain those categories. When we get down to the non-budgeted items, so let's use 2019 for example, we know that there are going to be people leaving the workforce and there's going to be natural turnover. And so we assume that we will have $8 million of operating surplus just from people leaving the workforce and creating this temporary vacancy in those positions till we can replace them. And then you'll see for this fiscal year, $6.9 million worth of technology projects. Those are all explained in the narrative under footnote F in your packet. And a lot of those have already either come to this board for approval or are working their ways through this approval. And they were also mentioned in the budget message. And many of these have been planned for several years. So I'm not gonna, take a long time talking about those. And then you'll see that the Board of Commissioners had designated or assigned equity for special projects, and that $645,000 just represents projects that were already approved this fiscal year for use of fund balance. So we back that out because that's not available to spend again going forward. And then the tri-party road project funding, that represents the $2 million that's in assigned fund balance that's traditionally been there each year for the road commission tri-party projects, as well as $2.4 million roughly of projects that were approved by this board but maybe have not begun yet. So we need to have that money still in fund balance to cover projects that were already approved but not spent or forwarded to the road
The projects
commission.
weren't necessarily approved yet, they were actually,
Part of the 2 million.
part of the allocation,
Yeah.
so the projects
Yeah.
haven't been brought to the commission yet.
But it's part of, it's, so you're always gonna have some prior years planned funding that hasn't been spent. But you'll see going forward for those, we're just assuming the $2 million of new projects. So with that, unless there's any questions about the format, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Dave Heber, so.
So let's see if there's any questions right now. First phase, Commissioner Middleton.
Yeah, funding the recommended 20% of operating, that $40 million,
No, it's,
80 million.
$98.2 million by 2024.
Okay, what line is that on?
That is, if you go to the very far right column and drop to the bottom, to the last row where you see a number, under 2024. Oh, yeah, oh, that's,
I can change it.
okay, he's got it, yeah.
Yep, balance protection, they call it.
Yeah, so you see target equity at September 30th, 2024, that would be 20% of the annual expenditures in that year. So based on these projections, and that's what they are, they're just projections, and just to refresh your memory, this is why we call it a rolling budget, because every year we do this and we update all these numbers. So we know these numbers are gonna change going forward, but what it does is it tells us what we're looking at that point in time, and it's really to identify the trends. So that this Board of Commissioners, as you're making decisions, you have a good base as to knowing how it affects fund balance based on the projections that we're establishing at this point in time.
Any other questions? Commissioner Quarles.
What page does your next presentation give?
414.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Okay.
any other questions? So now we're on PDF 414.
Correct.
Thank you.
Now we're on 415, so.
Okay.
It's on. I've done a similar presentation to this board for the last 3 years, and I know they're all on file, but what we try to do in the 5-year forecast for property values is, update it annually. I mean, we're much more comfortable with our first year forecast than we are our 5th year forecast, but in order to prepare this, when property taxes are 53% of our general fund revenue, we have to, do our best relative to the property taxes. So what I'm gonna do is go over the state equalized value, which is half of fair market value, go over taxable value, which what taxpayers pay taxes on, and talk a little bit about the 2 constitutional amendments that limit our growth in property tax revenue. And that's, one is the Headley Amendment from the 1970s, which requires us to roll our tax rate back. I'm gonna cover that. And then Proposal A from the 1990s, which limits the growth of taxable value to 5%, the rate of inflation, or whatever, whichever is less. We're gonna go through when we think our taxable value is gonna be restored to pre-recession levels. Talk about building permits, which are obviously affect us from a new revenue standpoint. And again, and just some of the factors that we monitor on a monthly basis to assist us with this. And when I say us, it's Bob and Lori and Lynn and myself, and even others, like Phil and Jerry Poison are involved with it as well. Next slide. Oops.
I hit it and then you hit it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Is just the makeup of the county's values. It really, we're around 75% residential properties, commercial, industrial, personal property make up the balance of that. And again, approximately 53% of our revenue comes from property taxes. Next is a bar graph where it shows 2007 at the bottom, where the SEV in the county, so half a fair market value in the county, was at $77.3 billion. That dropped around 35% to 2012, when we were down to $50.8 billion, and the taxable value dropped around 24% during that 2007 to 2012-13 timeframe. You notice at the top for 2019, we're close to being back to that $77 billion. We're at $76.7 billion. So our value, from a market value standpoint, has improved almost back to prior to the Great Recession, but it's still not back. The taxable value is still lagging behind that even further due to the limitations of Proposal A and Headley. And I have some real-life examples of individual properties to try to help illustrate how this actually works. Every 1% of taxable value increase equates to about $2.4 million in revenue, and that's using our 4.04 tax rate, which we will not be able to do for long. This is just a bar graph since Proposal A and some of the ways we do our estimates of taxable value growth. And you'll see in the Great Recession the below the line where the property values again dropped by either 35% on the SEV, 25% on taxable value, and where they've recovered to. And in the box down at the lower left, we do a little analysis to try to help us gauge where taxable value, what we can predict taxable value to be. And if you look at from 2015 to 19, the average taxable value increase was 3.8%, and the average inflation rate multiplier, the CPI that limits the increases, was 1.46%. So if you subtract those two, the difference is around 2 to 2.5% of market activity that we receive increase in taxable value from transfers of ownership where the value is popped up, or new construction or new personal property investment. So that's about what we've seen over the past, since the recession, since we've been improving. So once we know what the inflation rate is for a given year, and assuming we're not in a recession, we can assume some market increases. But we have to monitor that as well, and we are projecting we're still projecting growth, but less growth than what I said last year at this time when we did the same presentation. Sure.
Commissioner Powell.
What does the acronym IRM stand for?
Inflation rate multiplier, synonymous with the CPI, Consumer Price Index.
I'm a researcher.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, no problem.
Any other questions?
Wait a minute, say that again?
Inflation rate multiplier,
Okay, thank you.
or synonymous with the CPI, Consumer Price Index.
Commissioner
This is a small digression, and I don't want a long discussion on it, but I just want to throw out there, is there any discussion across the state about addressing the Headley/Prop A situation? It affects every local government in a really negative way, and is anybody talking about it?
A lot of people talk about it, but no one's done anything about it. No offense to those of you that were up there. But I'm not taking a shot, but it comes up every time. And I know, Tom, you and I have talked about this many times, so.
Actually, Dave Heber has taken the lead and has talked to, MAC and Michigan Municipal League and with Treasury. And there's just not the political will because everyone's afraid to touch it and, don't mess with
Because, my gosh, we
Proposal A.
wouldn't want to raise taxes on people. I know, I get it.
All we want to do is just like stop the roll back and,
exactly.
yeah, you understand from
I do
being in
understand
local
it, and I
government,
just
yeah.
wondered if there's, people that are actually talking about it, but you gave me the
Yeah,
answer. I
we think
expected.
there's a simple fix, and
Right.
Dave could give you what he thinks is a language fix if you could convince people to change it. It's the political will is the problem.
Right, okay, thanks. I'm done.
Thanks. Any other questions right now? Continue. Here
Sure.
we go. We're talking about the
I'm
Headley.
on 419, we're talking about Headley rollback. I'm not gonna read this slide to you, but this is put out by the Michigan Municipal League, that it's clear that everyone's aware that this is a huge factor for not just local governments, but any type of authority that whether it's OCC that uses property taxes, or the Oakland schools or the parks, correct. The bottom paragraph where it's highlighted, though, at the very bottom, even though taxable value increases on a particular piece of property at the rate of inflation, the millage rate for the entire community is rolled back. As a result, the increase of total taxable value of the community. The net result is less than inflationary increases in the actual dollars received from property taxes. So that's what we're faced with. And again, I'm not gonna read these all the way through. The next one is Citizens Research Council. Bottom paragraph, Proposal A controlled the growth of taxable values but did not control their declines, meaning that local units would lose values during downturns that would take decades to restore during recoveries. So those are just other sources, so if you don't believe me, you can. And moving on, 421 of your PDF. The county, through the equalization office, are a member of the Home Builders Association of Southeast Michigan. They've put on several presentations that I've been to. In fact, the executive director came in on December 3rd and gave an overview to Bob and Lori and myself. And this is a 4-county area, but the Oakland County information matched the same, but this is the most recent information that we have of Macomb, Oakland, St. Clair, and Wayne counties. You'll see that the 42-year average of building permits is around 9,700. And where we were in the 2006-07 timeframe, where we were much higher than the average, and where we dipped to during the recession, and the trend that's going forward for January of 2020, it's going down, and we're seeing that in the communities that we provide the contract assessing services for. There's still building permit, there's still gonna be market activity growth for us to have as in taxable value, but it's not as much as it was back in the before the recession. So the recovery is much slower than, and that kind of matches what that executive director, when he came out and met with us. Yeah, oh, and yes, he's offered to come here and talk to this board too, if you.
So I have a question about this.
Sure.
Does this capture remodeling, somebody that's
Well,
gutting a house and rebuilding it?
But, yeah, well,
This is only
this is new construction, but what we do as the local assessors do is, yes, remodeling, depending on the remodeling, may increase taxable value, but basically, like for like, wouldn't change anything. It would be normal maintenance to take your cupboards out over a period of time and put new cupboards in. It's major renovations where you're adding or putting additions on or creating living area in areas that were not living area before.
So I'm just looking at representing older communities, and so you're not gonna have tons of new build, but the renovation, the restoring of it is equally, valuable in some ways, but
There's no question that the more developed communities suffer more under Headley and Proposal A than the more rural communities that have opportunity for new growth.
Yeah, but as Dave mentioned, unless it's like an addition to your home, so it
It
so
doesn't
while
change
the
taxable.
market value might increase, the taxable value doesn't
Right.
increase.
Until it's sold.
Right.
And that triggers a Headley rollback, and there's your rollback, so. And again, there is positive news as well. This is a bar graph of sheriff's deeds. This is foreclosures for non-payment of mortgage. In 2007 through 2012, we experienced over 47,000 mortgage foreclosures, and as we all remember, many of them sat vacant for a long period of time, were a detriment to the neighborhoods, and then, we're finally out of that. Most all those are all sold back to private ownership. Last year, 2018, there were 658 mortgage foreclosures, which is, below the 2000 level. So that's a positive trend in the market, and hopefully that continues. We monitor this monthly, so if we start to see a spike in foreclosures, we will adjust our figures accordingly. So this is just another example of how we do our best to stay on top of the current market conditions.
And if you look at the graph, this is why Dave knew that the decline in property values were going to come, and he knew that in early 2007.
I have a question.
Commissioner Markham.
Just at the bottom of this chart, there's 1 in 532, 1 in 377, et cetera. What does that mean?
That's against the parcel count in the county. So if you look at the worst year, 1 in 51, that means if you drove down the street and counted 51 properties, one of them was foreclosed on.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
At the bottom of, this is
422.
422
422.
on page 9.
Okay,
It's
got
telling
it.
us the percentage.
Yeah.
It's in really small letters.
Okay.
On to page 423.
So one out of every 562 parcels.
Sorry.
That's okay. 423 shows our taxable value, the high, the low, the future, when we think we're gonna restore back to, from a taxable value standpoint, and then an actual property tax collection standpoint. In 2007, and this won't match what Lynn's stuff does, because this is rough numbers and order of magnitude, because there's TIF capture and all kinds of other things that go into it. But we had a taxable value of approximately $64.7 billion. We levied 4.19 mills, and we generated around $271 million in property taxes. 2012, taxable value dropped to $49.2 billion. We still levied 4.19 mills, and we collected around $206 million in property taxes. Based on the equalization report you just approved in April, we're back up to $60.2 billion. We're levying 4.04 mills, and we're collecting $243 million. If you carry that forward with some of the rollbacks that we're gonna be required to do, this is assuming that basically levying maximum authorized in those out years, we're gonna be back almost to the $271 million in 2022. So that, you know, it may be 2023, but it's not gonna be 2021 in my opinion. So that's a 15-year time frame to get back to our property tax collections from 2007. So
Dave, that's in absolute dollars.
yes, that's an absolute dollars. That's not adjusted for inflation. That's just dollars. So the path that from Proposal A and Headley is unsustainable long-term, so.
If you were to factor in inflationary considerations here, you'd actually see 20-year,
Oh, yeah.
25-year timeframe to get back.
So this is how it affected at the parcel level, and I think that this has been helpful as I go out to some of your city councils and or township boards and explain this. So if you look at this individual house, this happens to be in Berkeley. In 2007, this had a taxable value in an SEV of $94,000 approximately, and we levied our 4.19 mills on that property. The low in 2012 dropped that taxable value down to 59,540. We still levied our 4.19 mills. We collected $249 on that property. Today, the market has increased, and you'll see the SEV is even higher than it was in 2007, so it's worth more now post-recession than pre-recession. However, Proposal A has kept the taxable value down, limited the increases to 66,540. We're down to 4.04 mills. Keep in mind, our maximum authorized rate is 4.07 approximately, so 4.19 is gone. And so that tax reduction is $126 on this one property. So as the properties do not sell, the taxable value is held down, their tax bills are held lower. And I have some examples of ones that sold in here as well. So I'm gonna back up. So basically, we're looking at another 16 years, assuming a 2.5% inflation rate to restore on that one property to 2007. And that doesn't even take into account future Headley rollbacks. That's just assuming the 4.04 mils. So that's really, 16 years is way off, but the order of magnitude. It wasn't,
Cities have a parallel.
well, and it's not just in the cities, this one's Commerce Township on page 425. Same thing, I'm not gonna read these numbers to you. I think you all get the gist of what we're trying to show you. Unless you want me to read them. All right. And then the next page, I'm on 426. This is a typical industrial, this happens to be in Wixom. Same thing happened, the point is it wasn't just residential, it wasn't just in the cities of Berkeley, it was in the townships as well. Again, this is another one, 20 years to restore to pre-recession levels. Next one's a commercial in Birmingham, so I just tried to pick them from all over the area. Again, but this is an example of two properties that are very similar to one another. These happen to be in Ferndale. The property on the left has not sold since before 2006, so it has that Proposal A benefit of a lower taxable value. The bottom line on this house is that the property owner pays around $3,000 in total property taxes, $3,189. Very similar house, sold and became uncapped. This person pays around $7,000 in property taxes, and that's what triggers our Headley rollbacks. Another concern that I have going forward is that when, in 2006, there was a number of bills that were introduced, nothing passed to stop that increase, because people were paying, they're paying significantly more. This is a 120% increase for a very similar home. And quite often, they'll come to your local board of reviews and they'll complain that the realtor said that the property taxes were $3,000, and they were right, but they didn't finish the sentence where it's gonna be different for you. So then they go to their legislators to try to say, we have to change this law, this isn't fair, and they started to get a little bit of traction in 2006, and then it went away when the recession hit, because, you know, it wasn't a problem anymore. So that's just something that I'm concerned about going forward, is that whether there are bills that would say phase this in for a 5-year period or something along those lines. So anyway, whatever. The next one's another example. This one is another small property. I just asked the gentleman that handles Ferndale for us to find a couple for me, so I'm not picking on Ferndale, but that's been one of the hotter markets down there, so there's a bigger difference in the taxes. So this one, you know, $1,300 versus $4,500 in actual property taxes for very similar, for less than 1,000 square foot house.
They look good though in Ferndale. You can see that they're kept up and look nice.
Well, you know, and we took nice photos. Okay, shifting gears and more specifically to the Headley rollback. On the next slide, it tracks since Proposal A, and really, it's from 2006 to 2000, in the early 90s, the Board of Commissioners and the County Executive adopted budgets and lowered the tax rates on three different times, ultimately down to 4.19 mils. We levied 4.19 mils from 1998 to 2014, so that's 17 years of levying that same tax rate. So as taxable value was going up 4, 5, 6% a year, 7%, as high as 7% a year in some years, we were receiving that increase in property tax revenues by levying the same millage rate. We had to lower our maximum authorized rate, but we weren't lowering the rate we actually collected on. In 2006 to 2014, due to the market decline, the maximum rate was not required to be rolled back, so that you know, enabled us to continue levying that. In 2015, we've lowered our rate from the 4.19 to 4.09. We've also lowered the rate to 4.04 in 2016, and further in the 5-year fiscal plan that Lynn's going to go over the details on, we're recommending the need to lower the rate again due to staying ahead of the Headley rollback. But keep in mind, for the budget that you're preparing now, that you're going to go through the process of going through, we have to estimate what the rate is going to be for next July. So I won't know, or we won't know the total maximum rate until around April of 2020 for your July 2020 levy. So we've prepared a budget that we're making an estimate of what the Headley rollback is. We're getting very close to being in a problem where I'm going to say the maximum rate's going to be 4.02, and I'm going to be wrong. It's going to be 4, and then we're going to, a current year budget problem that we're already 6 months into the budget, and we find out that we've got a problem and our collections are going to be less. We're getting very close to that being a significant issue.
And this is a unique problem for counties, as opposed to cities, villages, and townships, because in 2004, there was a state law change where the state, in an effort to balance its budget, it changed the county levy date from a December levy to a July levy. And so now we're collecting in arrears, so we don't start receiving our tax revenue until 10 months after our fiscal year begins. So it makes it very problematic. And that was not done to cities, villages, and townships. So we were able, so Parks and Rec actually doesn't have that same challenge because Parks and Recreation is still able to levy its millage rate in December of each year. And so they will base that on known information, which is based on the equalization report that you just approved in April. But we have to budget based on next year's equalization report. So we're always trying to have to project conservatively. So that's why we try to stay ahead of that, what we think is the maximum authorized rate, because we don't want an unfavorable budget surprise where we have to cut budgets in the middle, 10 months after the fiscal year begins.
Commissioner Middleton
Yeah,
has a
I think
question.
that problem's even worse than that, is you can send out the bill 10 months into the year, but there's really no incentive to pay your taxes until September 15th on that summer tax bill.
That's right.
So really, the bulk of the money comes in 15 days before the
Yep.
end of your fiscal
That's
year.
right.
Any other questions at this point? Let's continue. Oh, wait, did you have something, Nancy? No, okay, let's continue.
The next chart is just a Excel spreadsheet that's turned into a PowerPoint of the tax rates from 1994, our maximum authorized rates, what we collected, and what the Headley rollbacks were. So that basically is the information off of the sheet prior, with the exception of the yellow. So everything that says 2019 and above, I know it's busy, I'm not gonna go through it with you, but this is for really transparency to show you exactly what we're projecting and why. But what we're projecting for 2020 is a taxable value increase of 4.25, that's adjusted down from 4.5 that we, last year at this time. We're looking at an inflation rate multiplier, or CPI, which is the synonymous, at 1.9%. And we backed off what we think the new construction's gonna be because of the building permit activity, and then that calculates into our Headley rollback. So everything down there in the yellow, I know it's small, I know it's busy, but when you can tie this back to when we talk about what we're proposing, this is the why relative to the property tax portion of it. And I'd be happy if anyone wants to go over this in more detail individually to let me know. Sure.
Commissioner Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in your, in the additions column and
Yep.
for the assumptions?
Yep.
What, I see it's like, you know, you got 1, 4, 5.
Yeah, look at
for 3
what.
years, and then the last 3 years. So what, is that like additions, like projects we're doing, or is
Yeah,
that
those-
just
that-
potential additions?
Those are just marketplace additions, new neighborhoods, new commercial buildings, and additions to the tax rolls.
Okay.
And then if you look at it, that ties into that building permit chart. If you go up into 2002, 2006, we were up over $2 billion in new construction. And then that's, even though it's come back from the recession from less than $1 billion, we're coming back. But I think the projections are, I mean, my crystal ball is no clearer than anybody else's, other than just looking at the data and doing the best that we can. It's been fairly accurate for a long time. And it helps that we do 32 of the communities on assessing contracts, so we have the real-time information. So those contracts that'll be coming to you for approval for another 3 years are an important part of us being able to do this, and then tying it into to what Lynn and Lori and Bob.
And we check our assumptions against other independent economic forecasts, so the Home Builders Association that
Okay.
Dave talked about, they've been forecasting a slowdown in construction, as well as the Comerica economic report that we get. So we look at all this information, is there a trend here, is everyone saying the same thing? And they're all saying that it has been a slowdown at the beginning of this year in new construction.
Yeah, still growth, just less
Yeah.
growth.
Yeah, less growth.
We need to get you a new crystal ball.
That would help me out, I would love it. And then this is the analysis for the 2020 taxable value and Headley rollback, the inflation rate multiplier, or CPI. So the figures are released monthly. We track it every month. have independent agencies like Comerica saying 1.9% for this year's inflation rate. So that,
Revenue estimation conference.
at the revenue estimation conference, that some will range up to 2.1. So we're using 1.9 in our analysis right now. And if something on this changes significantly as we add the months of April, May, June, all the way through September, we will make adjustments to both in a, I guess this is tough to say, but if inflation goes up, it's better for people that generate property tax revenue, but, you know, I'm not gonna sit here and say inflation's good either, so, but this is just, again, why are we using 1.9? That's what it's tracking at right now. We'll make adjustments as we go forward. And then the next slide, I'm on 433. This just shows the difference of what the maximum authorized rate of 4.0787 versus the 4.04 we currently levy, the difference in property tax revenues to the county. So every 0.01 is around $600,000 of property tax revenue. So there's really, depending on how you look at it, $2.3 million of savings to the taxpayer, or $2.3 million that we didn't collect, however you want, whatever way you look at it. And these are the projections that in the 5-year plan. Like I said, last year, we were, it's actual up until 2019, 2020 through 23. Our estimates, we're at 4.25 going forward, and again, that ties into the busy Excel sheet, and then what Lynn is gonna go over. Kind of beat this to death, but this just kind of summarizes the millage rollback with how the CPI interacts with that and when some of the timing is. I won't read that, but they're in your hand, in your PDF. Lori talked about the change in the collection, that we collect in arrears. That's on 436. And again, so the variables all include number of transfers, new construction, just market conditions, and then any future tax exemptions that may come up, you know, any changes in legislation. So with that, any questions or?
Any questions for Dave Heber right now? Let's move on to Lynn, please.
I'm just gonna bring up the PDF again. Okay, so now we're gonna go back to the operating adjustments from the framework document. So Dave covered the operating revenue adjustments that we're going to have to make for property tax revenue. So this worksheet goes fiscal year by fiscal year, indicating our changes from the last budget that was submitted and approved by the Board of Commissioners.
It's back to the one.
So we're on PDF 274. We're going back to the worksheet.
My recommendation is have your hard copy of the spreadsheet, and then you can reference the PDF page for the footnotes, as Lynn
Yes.
explained. Do you want to switch, Lynn?
No, I'll be good,
You're
'cause
going to
I'll just-
navigate? Okay.
Okay, so if you look at 2020 for the millage rate, we're going to be adjusting the millage rate down from 4.04 mils to 4.02. Now, but that is a slight improvement over what we had projected from the last year's budget proposal, where we had projected that we would have to roll it back to 4.00 mils.
And actually, this is summarized, it would be page 7 of the narrative.
So 281.
So,
So if
yeah,
I,
page PDF 281.
There it
Yeah,
is.
at the very top there.
There it is. So it's a little bit easier to read on this document page, is showing what the millage rates are going to have to be rolled back to for each fiscal year. So for 2020, we have to roll it back to 4.02 mils. Our projection with Dave's crystal ball is indicating that the maximum authorized would possibly be 4.04711. That is very too close to call. We don't want to run into an issue and have to have budget reductions after we get the equalization report. So we're proposing to reduce the millage rate with 2020 to 4.02 mils. With 2021, the rollback will further be will continue to 4.00 mils. Then with 2022 and 2023, it will be reduced to 3.95 mils, and for 2024, down to 3.90 mils.
2023 is 3.93.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay. I'm looking at it on an angle from a laptop. So that's, for 2020, that's a .02 millage rate reduction. So that equates to roughly $1.2 million, as Dave had indicated on one of his slides, that every .01 represents about $602,000 worth of property tax revenue.
Lynn, we have a question from
Sure.
Commissioner
I'm sorry.
Markham.
So where does it end? I mean,
It's
theoretically, if I follow this chart out to 2045, we're not collecting taxes
This
to
model is-
operate the
This
county.
model is not sustainable, right? We can't roll back to zero. We won't be able to
You'd
cover
have to go
operations.
for a vote of the people to have them increase the maximum authorized rate
Countywide or statewide?
countywide.
If we continue.
And
with
some
this-
communities do that. Actually, some communities balance their budget during the Great Recession by asking the voters to allow them for additional taxing power. We did not do that. We balanced the budget through expenditure reductions. But at some point, some future board is probably gonna have to make that decision to ask the voters to approve a maximum authorized rate, because you're right, theoretically, you cannot operate on zero. Yeah, or the legislators are gonna have to fix the law.
There's other counties that have, so we have a general operating millage rate, and then we have a parks and rate millage rate. There are other counties that have multiple millage rates for debt service, for public safety. We don't have that.
Not pretty, thank you.
Any other questions before Lynn moves on? Okay.
So those are the millage rates that we will be incorporating with the county exec recommendation. I'm going to move back up to, actually, I'll just refer to the page so you can,
Yeah, below
Okay.
that is the taxable value changes from the budget.
right, and so those are the changes. If you refer back to 274 on your document, and it's up on the screen, those are the taxable value increases that we're projecting over the next 5 years. So it's, the next 3 years is 4.25%, and then in 2023, 2024, we're projecting a 4% increase in taxable value. And there are some slight changes from what we adopted with last year's budget process. So it indicates it's a 4.25% increase. That's last year we projected a 4.5% increase for 2020.
And some of these decreases are based also on economic reports that say that the current growth is going to slow. So they're not saying, they're saying there's a possibility of going into recession. None of these numbers reflect a recession. If we have another recession, we're definitely going to have to either ask for a millage increase or impose budget reduction tasks again. This assumes what the economists are saying is that potentially we'll still have continued slow growth going forward, but we all know that right now we're kind of like at the cusp of it could go one way or the other.
And during the economic outlook luncheon that took place at the end of April, they were thinking that for the next 2 to 3 years, they're not seeing that necessarily hit just yet, but, and so that, and again, that's not baked into this forecast, but it is a
So
possibility.
you'll see some preliminary indicators before it affects our property tax revenues. For example, you will see the state begin to have problems with their revenues in income taxes and sales taxes because those react more immediately to a recession. Property taxes react later when a recession hits, but also when the economy rebounds, property taxes are also the last revenue source to have an increase as well. So it will be affected, but will be the one of the last impacted by a recession and the last to come out of a recession.
Commissioner Powell.
Okay, so I have a question. That all you gave us a report before, and you have predicted that there possibly will be a recession, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, when we went to the economic outlook, they didn't say that. They said that they're not expecting that. So,
It's, yeah,
Is that, are we all, I thought that was all under the same hub
Yeah.
though.
The
Or is the
timing of it.
economic summit something different to where we outsource for them to
Oh,
come in?
you're right, there are conflicting messages from economists right now, that's why I was.
Okay, cause
Yeah.
I was lost at I was like, Dad, I just told us
No.
it was gonna be a
It's
recession.
50-50.
Timing, it's.
Okay, I just
It's
thought,
coming.
okay.
Very good chance that there will be a recession.
No, I know who he is. I know who Dad he is, so I would prefer
Well,
to stick with what Dad said.
I'm gonna brag about Bob. Before, Bob was the one that knew that the auto industries were in trouble, and he'll tell you he didn't call which automotive company would file for bankruptcy, but he knew that probably one or two of them would file for bankruptcy, which did happen, and the economists were not projecting that at the time. So
Oh.
Bob digs very deep into some numbers.
I've been at the table with him with
Yeah.
Pontiac issues,
Yeah,
so
yeah, so
I
you know,
understand.
yeah.
Thank you.
August of
He's forewarned us a
2007, I
lot.
predicted Ford would go under.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
2 years later, GM
Right.
and Chrysler. Right idea, wrong companies.
Commissioner Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I piggyback on the same question, I was gonna ask the same question later, is, so, when they have the economic luncheon, do they not, like, talk to you guys and collaborate? I mean, it's because we're given, like, the county conflicting messages.
So I think with the economic luncheon, what they're really focused on are the jobs being created in Oakland County. And they will tell you what the risks are. So back then, they did express concerns about the viability of the auto companies. I think it just hit so fast and so hard. So what was going on at the time? Gasoline prices spiked dramatically. That's something that economists can't necessarily predict. They might tell you it's a risk. I think that's a risk right now because gas prices have been historically low, right? So they don't really have much more room to move down. So it's kind of the same scenario that sent this area into deep recession. We had a decade-long recession, but it was the gas prices that really impacted our local economy. So I think what they do is nationally, they look at the different models, and they have these, and they're not looking at the microeconomies necessarily. Our economists are looking at our microeconomy, and that looks promising. But there's things like if a war happens, if there is a natural disaster, all of those things are not predictable.
Any other questions right now?
Okay. So after property taxes, on your worksheet, the next item adjustment is an adjustment to interlocal agreements for contracted services, and this is for law enforcement services. So there was a resolution that was brought before the Board of Commissioners in December 2018 to do contractual agreements for law enforcement for various communities from 2019 through 2021. Those rate increases are factored in, and it's on the operating worksheet here. It's indicating for 2020, that's going to bring an additional $1.5 million worth of revenue, and thereafter, $2 million. So it's on, right in your, within your operating revenue adjustments portion of that. So note C that I have up on the screen is explaining this resolution has already been approved by the Board of Commissioners, so those revenues are impacting the budget in a positive way. However, if you look down into the operating expenditure adjustments, those are offset by their negotiated contracts, labor contracts that have increased their total compensation package. So those are basically offsetting adjustments. Next, under revenues is the revenue sharing from the state of Michigan. So, with that, we received information with the governor's budget proposal that revenue sharing would increase by 3% for the statutory revenue sharing payments. That equates to about $1.1 million worth of additional revenue for the county. So we baked that into the fiscal plan based on the information that we had available, with the footnote when we presented it during the preliminary revenue estimates, that is just a recommendation. It's not an adopted, it's not an approved budget yet by the state. And sure enough, as just before we were getting ready to publish this document, the Senate subcommittee took a vote to eliminate the governor's proposal for the revenue sharing increase and keep it at these 2019 levels. So if you were to take out that 1.125 million for the next 5 years, that is just over $5.6 million. So that changes this whole worksheet where we had that rounding error that Mr. Patterson referred to. That changes it to basically where we'll be below the 20% target by about $5.7 million in 2024.
So that could equate to a $1 million budget reduction task that we would ask to spread across all the departments to absorb that. What should be noted, though, is the House Subcommittee is recommending a larger increase to state revenue sharing for counties above the 3%. So we're kind of just monitoring what's going on at the state. It's too soon to call it, so.
And this is unlike the, city situation where they have both statutory, and discretionary, if you will, and constitutionally protected revenue sharing. We have no constitutionally protected revenue sharing. It's all statutory.
Okay, moving on. So with the last budget proposal for 2020 through the remaining out years, we had factored in a 1% placeholder for general salary increase for county employees. That was a placeholder we look at each year to determine with the next budget, are we able to do better, or do we have to scale that back? And with the compensation study that has been underway for almost a year and a half, 2 years now, that proposal is expected to come to the Board of Commissioners this summer. So we got some preliminary information from HR as to the draft information provided by their consultant, and they were seeing an increase in overall compensation for the non-represented employees. So for 2020, we said we're not going to present or propose any general salary increase. We're going to remove that 1%, and we're going to let the compensation study be presented to the Board of Commissioners to basically reset those compensation based on the market information coming from the compensation study consultant. So that represents around $2.4 million a year that we could use to offset the compensation study. The compensation study is more than 1% based on the rough estimate that we received from HR. And for those out years 2020 through 2024, it will have it will be an additional cost of around $2.1 million over and above what we had factored into the budget. So again, we're still waiting for that updated report from MAG. They're supposed to have it according to HR, in early June, so that we can kind of crunch through the numbers, present it, and they will bring it before the Board of Commissioners, which at that time, when it's brought forward, there will be the financial impact, and that budget amendment will be made with that resolution.
Okay, so Lynn, so at this point, we're waiting for that presentation, and then we will assign whatever percentage increase or the.
Right.
And that would go across the non-represented and also the ones that are unionized that have the Me Too's as well?
No, the represented employees were not part of the compensation study.
They will have to do a wage reopener. So this is just for the non-represented areas.
What do you say?
The Me Too is on the fringe benefits.
And
Okay.
the salaries, if it's greater.
Oh, if it's greater, then, yeah.
Okay, so we're not assigning,
So-
saying where it's a 1% for everybody this year. It'll be adjusted for the non-represented employees.
Right,
Correct.
it's resetting.
Resetting it.
Yes.
Non-representative.
Okay, and Commissioner Powell.
Non-representative, you referring to, like, what is it, what?
Non-unionized.
Non-unionized.
Non-union.
Yeah, because the labor unions, they negotiate their salaries.
Yeah, I was just making,
Yeah.
just trying to clear it up.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
For example, I'm sorry.
No, I know the difference. I just was
Well,
trying to figure out if
okay.
that's what it was.
The law enforcement bargaining units for the jail corrections, the road patrol deputies, and the command staff have negotiated a 2% increase for 2020, 21, and 22, or through, I'm sorry, 2000 and through 2021, and that is factored into the operating adjustments.
Thank you, Commissioner Markham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, you said a while back that the fund balance reduction was not going to be applied to anything that would be, that it would be normally applied to a one-time deal. But in here, the compensation plan implementation, you're actually showing every year there's a reduction out of the fund balance to cover
Well,
that.
it affects fund balance, but we're not proposing to use fund balance. So that, remember at the beginning, I said we broke it out into 3 sections. Ongoing operating revenues, ongoing operating expenditures, all adjustments to the operating budget. And then the bottom one was non-budgeted use of fund balance. So this is just saying that it does affect fund balance. But we're not recommending that that continue ongoing. At some point, we're gonna have to come into structural balance.
But this doesn't show that we're gonna be doing it over those next few years then.
What it shows is when we get to the subtotal, that it does balance out by the time we get to 2024. In the intervening years, it doesn't. So if you go to item 2, where it says subtotal projected net adjustments to operating budget, that summarizes all the operating revenue and operating expenditure changes and how that impacts the bottom line. So you're right in that there's a significant impact for 2021, 2022, and 2023, but a positive result by the time we get to 2024.
Okay.
So it does reduce fund balance, and so this plan is to try to maintain the minimum target of 20%.
Longer term.
Longer term, right.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Miller.
Yeah, I just want to state a point of reference. You mentioned that a wage opener for the contracts, just for the board here, that's only if it's in their contract, it's a wage opener.
Correct.
So they don't think that we could automatically go to them.
Correct. Some of them are like that, and as the example that Lynn used with the deputies, they already have negotiated 2% increase. However, let's say so we're not recommending a general salary increase in 2020, they'll get their 2%. But let's say in 2021, if we were to recommend a 3% adjustment, theoretically, I'm not saying we're gonna do that, because we can't afford to do that, I don't think. But let's say we recommended a 3% in 2021, then the deputies would get the 3% rather than the 2% that they negotiated.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the next. So with the proposed salary adjustments and compensation plan implementation, we're now moving on to the operational support that is needed for technology projects. So one of the projects that was brought before the Board of Commissioners was the Universal Communications System, UCC. It was a 3-phase project to update our outdated technology analog telephone type system, and that will have an operational impact starting in 2021 of roughly $538,000 per year. So that is being baked into the long-term forecast, and it's being baked into the rates and allocations being charged through the Telephone Communications Fund. I'm going to come back to all these technology items here in a moment, but the other adjustment that we have is there's internal service fund rate adjustments that we need to consider. So we have internal service funds would be, for example, the Information Technology Fund, the Motor Pool Fund, the Facilities Maintenance and Operations Fund for maintaining the county campus and the county buildings. Each year we look at those rates and allocations to determine, are they meeting their operational needs? Do they have a sustainable fund balance? One of the areas that we've seen issues with, and we know with technology, because costs go up and it's technology changes quite frequently, is the IT fund is going to require an increase in their operational rates. And so we have projected a $1.5 million increase in overall internal service rate adjustments. So why I say that about our IT fund, I think Bob's laughing here, because the state just issued their comprehensive annual financial report. So we're trying to make sure that our IT fund does not go into a deficit situation, which we would have to come up with a deficit elimination plan. The state just released their financial statements, and their IT fund has a deficit of $1.1 billion. Up from around 800 million.
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, you're right, they're cutting the IT appropriations too, which is only gonna make that situation worse. Yeah.
So our,
Without changing the revenue on the other side.
so we're trying, we try to make sure that we avoid those deficit situations if we do go into, if one of those internal service funds has an unrestricted net position deficit, we are required to come up with a deficit elimination plan and resolve that issue within 5 years. So in comparison to the state, our,
Can you just summarize too the impact on fund balance here, so to help offset some of those operating adjustments, we actually have for most of part a positive.
okay, I'm gonna go back up then.
And then we can turn it over to Bob.
Okay. So if you go back to the worksheet on 274, I think you have a hard copy in front of you, the overall net adjustments to plan use of fund balance is right before the revised estimated year-end fund balance projection. So with 2019, we're expecting with the operational changes, a change of 748,000. 2020, 5.5 million in increase from the plan change. With 2021, 843,000. So it does vary over the next several years. So there are some ups and some downs to this. Our target in the end is $98.2 million. That does not take into account any additional revenue sharing adjustments that may come about, and it does not also include a number of items that are not baked into this fiscal plan, but are included into the narrative of this document that Bob will now cover. Do you want me to go to those?
I'm up?
You're up.
About what's not in the plan that are risks to
Yeah.
our budget.
So it's, whoops, let me go back up here.
Go
So
to
that will
page
begin on
14.
PDF.
Page 14 of the memo.
So it's PDF 288.
First item here deals with pensions. Right now, our OPEB fund is well overfunded. I see absolutely no problems in OPEB going forward. Unlike a lot of the local communities who have really significant issues relating to OPEB. I just looked at Bloomfield Township, for example. They have 10 million in assets, and they have $150 million worth of accrued liabilities. So they're unfunded by about $140 million. That means that at some point in time, they're going to have a problem in paying their retirees' health care going
They're
forward.
looking at a millage. Okay, let's move on.
That's right. Long and short here is that on the pension side, we're pretty much break even on our pension. But to that end, we're about 100% funded, a little over that. That's pretty close call going forward.
And we're assuming this year that we're only gonna achieve half of our assumed rate of return.
Yeah, so to that end, if the market were to decline, it would actually trigger additional pension contributions of any amount. We have a number of capital programs that have been proposed by a number of folks, including the sheriff, who is discussing a training facility need. And we also note that the sheriff's dispatch right now is in a very old building. We've had facility issues with regards to that building relative to keeping dispatch functional. And of course, the emergency operating center would go with the sheriff's dispatch if we were to move all of those functions. That could be, a building in the amount of about $60 million or so. There has not been any architectural studies done, and the sheriff's department has committed to provide similar types of buildings and operations going forward from other communities, so that we can have further discussions on this particular issue. But this is not in the plan right now.
And it might require additional special millage in
Yes.
order to fund that.
That would be, a fairly costly endeavor here that could trigger a millage. Radio communication system, I think we've talked about that before. The legislatures are right now dealing with something called Raise the Age, where it deals with the 17-year-olds going to prison. And they are considering shipping them down to us to be responsible for that, with some level of funding to be provided. Right now, we've not done any analysis on that because it's been such a long-term discussion, and there are so many different plans on the table here before it actually gets done, that it's hard to put together a plan when they're still drafting the legislation. Now, the possibility is that we would get reimbursed, but if the child care fund issues represent the same manner in which they would consider dealing with this program, we've got a lot of debates in front of us on that
And they
particular
won't
issue.
reimburse for capital costs.
Right.
So the big challenge here will be how it affects our facilities at Children's Village, which are old, and we may not be able to afford to have them housed here any longer. We may have to ship them out if it's so prohibitive that we can't have the capital funding required to continue to house them here in our own programs.
These are 17-year-olds here who have committed felonies that are heading into prison, who are coming back in group settings with younger folk. Figure out what'll happen.
With due respect, can we continue on the liabilities? There's 2 other committees that need to meet today, starting at 11, so.
Okay. The Michigan Indigent Defense Commission, Phase 2. I'm not aware of any funding in the budget going in the state right now to bring online Phase 2, and yet they're going to do it sometime next year. The more costly of the 2 phases is Phase 2, not Phase 1. And we had a fair amount of debates going on in Phase 1. And the real issue deals with the workloads of the indigent defense attorneys. And that will be a real problem for us on a primary basis in funding the indigent defense. But if their workloads are set at a level well below our prosecutors, it will have a secondary impact on our prosecuting staff. That being here, why am I working for the prosecutor with a workload of 200 cases when the state is funding at about 50. So that'll be a problem in potentially retaining prosecutors and/or what we're paying them. So there's going to be, and by the way, that secondary piece, state isn't going to even consider dealing with that issue. Not if they're going to not fund the prosecutors for the arraignments. Trial court funding, this will affect not only the county court, but it'll also affect the local courts as well. The entire fee structure relating to trial courts is about to change. Essentially, they're going to be setting fees from the state, by the legislators. The collections on the fees will be sent up to Lansing, and the distribution will come back down on some basis yet to be committed to. Oakland County has never done well on formula-based distributions from the state. So whatever we send up there is going to be scattered elsewhere, and the net effect will be a reduction in support for our court that'll either result in a reduction in their operations, or alternatively, we'll have to find the money to cover what is lost by sending the fees to Lansing and not getting our fair share back. That's just reality. And then the competing resources for taxpayer funding is the 120-page document that I shipped off here before. It's been updated, and it continues to be updated for more efforts. It goes well beyond what the University of Michigan dealt with in terms of just jobs. It deals with a much more holistic approach of what's happening internationally, nationally, at the state level, regionally, and at the county level. So to that end, I'll leave you to read that, but I can tell you that the underpinnings relating to the various issues discussed in that effort, particularly as it relates to their auto companies, are fairly significant. And if some of the predictions by the economists that I've cited come to pass, we will be down to a level of 13 or 14 million vehicles a year, maybe lower, which is just above where we were in the Great Recession. If that happens, the entire state will have to reset its governmental operations, locally and the county.
Thank you. Any further questions? Seeing none. Any other business come before finance? I want to thank you for a thorough presentation. Appreciate it. Okay, I need a voice vote. It was a motion to receive and file. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? I do want to let you know that we are going to set some budget hearing dates. And so we will let you know about that sooner versus later so we can get it into our calendars. Yes?
Are you planning to do each department separately?
We are definitely going to have an opportunity to have more time for each department to present. Any other questions, comments? Thank you. Committee adjourned at 11:07.